presentation, thank you for being here. Not physically here. Thank you for being in this fight. I mean that sincerely. We were talking earlier and I was saying how it's not often that I get to bring every part of my identity into the space. Excuse me, so you'll forgive me, I'm excited because I don't have to just be either a Christian or don't have to just be an educator or a scholar. I can bring each of those places, each of those parts of me into this place very intentionally. And the only time I hear my faith being discussed in terms of education is usually used as a veneer to advance some of the most inhumane, unjust, and backwards policies, things that don't resemble the founder of our faith at all, even remotely. And so I'm grateful that you are doing this work. We have been waiting on you, and your voices are incredibly important. I want to honor Reverend Dr. Senator, because I know that you are fighting a major fight. We follow education policy all over the country. In many ways, Florida has been ground zero. Yeah. And so I want to appreciate you for the work that you do. And if it's all right with you, I'd like to talk with you a little bit about on the topic of mapping the landscape, the not so new educational terrain. As you heard in my introduction, I am a lot of things, but I'm also a history teacher. And I always, in the classroom, I try to teach thematically. Try to engage kids in something that they can wrap their arms around, something that makes what we're talking about tangible, so that it's not just dead people and dates, right? And the one thing I would always tell them is that we make the crucial mistake of teaching history as a line. When the truth of the matter is, history is really more of a circle, or even a cycle, if you will. The past is prologue. What happens and has happened in the past will be, and the utility or the function of that is that I believe we're supposed to take as much and glean as much as we possibly can from past events to discern patterns, themes that aid us in predicting what's going to happen next. So that the next time it comes around, we could literally be ahead of the curve. One could look at education and history in particular as a map that lets us know where we are located, or even a clock that lets us know what time it is. So the natural question that emanates from that framing is, well, where are we? And my question is admittedly kind of bleak. I get accused a lot of not being very inspiring when I discuss this topic. But I want to be honest with you, that we are in perilous times that require a response and an awareness of what is unfolding before us. I don't think this is too dark an assessment of things. Even though I'm accused of being morbid oftentimes, what I'm not typically accused of on this topic is being wrong that much. You may have noticed the drastic slide in this country toward fascism. I'm going to return to that because I don't use that word loosely. The rolling back of things such as affirmative action that have made way for individuals like myself to have opportunities at advancement and inclusion. The demonization of concepts such as woke, which has become a catch-all phrase for anything that offends folks who are used to being in positions of power. So-called critical race theory and DEI, a mashup of terms and word salad that don't mean much of anything other than things that traditional power-holding groups don't like. This is not hyperbolic from where I sit, because when I look at the definition of fascism, it literally has two definitions, and I'll read them both. The first is a political philosophy, movement, or regime that exalts nation, or often race, above the individual, and that stands for centralized autocratic government headed by a dictatorial leader severe economic and social regimentation, and forcible suppression of opposition. A lot of features to that definition, but I'm sure when you just kind of look back and take a peer over current events, things within the past couple of years, you can see that that's kind of fits. The other is more simple. The tendency toward or actual exercise of strong autocratic or dictatorial control. And I would submit to you that that is what's occurring right now with our public schools. It is a plan that is decades old in the making. And it's a repeat, a cycle that continues to reanimate itself over and over again. And just when you think that you've cast it out, out of whatever, it just reanimates into one body. You cast it out of one individual and it goes into the swine. It's still here. It's still active. And so what we're noticing is that history, as I mentioned, is rhyming again. We're starting to see these patterns. And when I talk about the history of oppression, as people of faith, we know this should not be a surprise to us, because that's the function and utility of the Bible. We know we don't exist in the time when those stories were captured, but we know and are well versed in the stories of oppression: Egyptian oppression, Babylonian oppression, Assyrian oppression, Persian oppression, Greek and Roman oppression. And it's our job to look at those stories and not just learn and understand the character and the nature of God, but to understand who we should be in these moments. I heard someone talk about being Jeremiah, bringing the voice of the wilderness. And so that's what I'm offering today, is to pull out of the biblical context and apply that same historical thinking to where we are now. Because the playbook of humanity really hasn't changed much. The playbook being used currently as it pertains to the attacks on education come from an era, a 12-year period after emancipation, known as Reconstruction. How many are familiar with Reconstruction? It's one of these periods that honestly presented the greatest amount of promise for America to live up to her ideals. And it's often referred to as a brief 12-year moment in the sun, where the formerly enslaved people come out from this institution of 200 plus years of slavery and go from being systemically oppressed, and in many southern states end up in the state house, just like our sister here. Literally, I mean, just from being enslaved to being state senators and state representatives, and even being in Congress. Some of the broadest, most sweeping social reforms that have ever taken place in this country come from that period. One of them is universal public education. Yes. Many, including myself, did not know that what we understand as public ed today is a feature of this period. Prior to, you did not have universal compulsory tax-supported schools. You had a smattering of private tutors and schools, if you will, that the land-owning class, the aristocratic class, had access to, that those who lived by the sweat of their brow did not have access to. And when you did have tax-supported schools, it was incomplete. You didn't have full school years. It was not very well funded. But the first thing formerly enslaved people did, once they got to those state houses, they said, we want to change the state constitutions, and we're going to enshrine all throughout the South now access to education as a right for everybody. Not just black folk, but for everybody. And so that was a revolutionary concept, because it begins the evening of the playing field, and they were clear that education was the vehicle to do that. Because they have literacy and numeracy. And mind you, at a time prior to that, it was unlawful for enslaved people to read. Which is really a tell, right? For those who, who play poker or whatever. It's really a tell about the true power of education, right? Because they knew, those who were in the positions of power, that if those folks had access to the ability to learn on their own, then it would ruin the structure, the dynamic of oppressed versus oppressor. That it makes one unfit to be enslaved. And so they instituted laws literally in North Carolina. They're all throughout the South. North Carolina, 1831. They made it unlawful to teach an enslaved person to read, not just for black folk, but if a white person got caught teaching an enslaved person to read, they could be hit not just with a fine, but with lashes. That tells us about the power of the thing that they've been trying to keep away. So I want you to keep that same frame in your mind. Folks who are in power are clear about what access to education does to the social order. Because that same spirit is what's present in our modern context today. Carter G. Woodson, who is a luminary, was a luminary. Also, his life gives us a picture of what we're dealing with also. Carter G. Woodson is known as the father of the Black History movement. And so we know that February in the United States is Black History Month, where that comes from a celebration known as Negro History Week, started by Carter G. Woodson, someone whose parents were born into enslavement himself. And after Reconstruction, the early 1900s, when there was this thing, it was called lots of things, but essentially it was a backlash. So those 12 years were quickly erased, and you had white supremacists who retook state houses and immediately didn't do away with the public education system, but they segregated. And it wasn't just that they segregated them, but they deliberately underfunded the black schools. I want you to put a pin in that, because in our state, we're still dealing with the legacy of that feature as well. None of these things are disconnected from their source. But it wasn't just that they underfunded these schools. There was a fraught competition over what would be taught in these schools. Well, what do we teach people? What can they learn? And as you can imagine, there wasn't a lot of investigation of anything prior to enslavement, especially for black folk. Black people weren't privy to learning anything about Africa, not just Africa, pre-colonial Africa, but the world. And Carter G. Woodson said, I think that there's more to offer. I think that young people, black people, should be able to learn about the accomplishments of their foreparents. And I believe there's more out there. So because these school systems wouldn't offer it, he made it his business. He was the first or the second PhD, black person to get a PhD from Harvard University. And he started creating his own materials outside of the view of the school system and going around and offering these and creating a celebratory atmosphere around the learning about our history as a people. Eventually this becomes adopted. Negro History Week becomes Black History Month. But the movement to learn more about ourselves has been something that's been in the belly of black folks when it comes to public schools for 100 years. This is not new. Conversely, there was a backlash movement to that most of us don't know about. An organization, a neo-Confederate organization known as the United Daughters of the Confederacy. Who, when you think about the Confederate monuments, most of which didn't even come up or get erected until the 1950s or 60s.
You preaching truth, brother.
Okay. These are not old monuments. But these are folks who were the descendants of literal Confederate soldiers who made it their business to police what schools were teaching about enslavement and began to wage an information war, or a culture war, we might call it in modern terms. They took objection to describing this civil war as being over the right to enslave. In fact, they began to frame it as something much more noble than that. It was an unfinished endeavor. In fact, it was a cause that was lost. They are literally responsible for introducing the language of the lost cause narrative. And do you know where they waged this war at? In the local schools. They organized themselves into state chapters and they began to contest the state boards of education and the local school districts. And any curriculum materials that they spotted something that ran against the narrative of the lost cause, they applied pressure until they bowed to their demands. Now, does that sound familiar to anyone? I want you to follow me here. The premise I'm working with here is that history is not a line. It is a circle. But the UDC was largely successful all throughout the South, but they literally propagated the lost cause ideology throughout schools and using the school system. We've been here before. Fast forward to 1954. In 55, you have Brown versus Board of Education, arguably one of the most consequential Supreme Court decisions in the history of the United States. Was not purely an educational decision. It was a decision that reverberated throughout every sector of society. And not everybody was very happy about that. It's a bit of an understatement. But we'd like to think, well, first of all, most integration efforts didn't even take a hold until about 10 to 12 years after that court case. You don't start actually getting traction with desegregation until the mid-60s. But what's important to know is states immediately, I'll use North Carolina as an example, and then I go to Virginia, immediately started trying to find ways to undermine the notion of living up to the pluralistic, democratic ideals of the United States, and began trying to tear down the very institution of public education that had been built coming out of enslavement. In North Carolina, they introduced something in 1955 known as the Pupil Assignment Act, and there was a plan called the Pearsall Plan, named after the individual from Governor Hodges who was given a charge over creating a committee, Thomas Pearsall. And the plan he came up with was to, if white folk didn't want to desegregate, they should be able to take the money allocated to their children and go somewhere else. Does that sound familiar? It is the predecessor of what we now know as school vouchers, or opportunity scholarships is what we call it in North Carolina. The taking of public funds to private institutions so that the pupils don't have to go to school with undesirables. The most extreme version of this took place in Prince Edward County in Virginia. Anyone from Virginia? I'll give you a brief story. Not only did Prince Edward County take a similar approach, and here's what's interesting. Every state had a version of this. Every state throughout the former Confederacy. So it wasn't like one state did it. One state did it, and then it went from one place to another place. And we see that same pattern now, don't we? In this modern fight that we're in. Prince Edward County said, not only will we do that, but we'll shut the schools down. And they did. They shut the schools down for a couple of years. So this, literally, they said if we can't have it the way we want to have it, nobody have access to education. That's the sort of extremism that they were dealing with there, and I want to argue that that same spirit is animating this present movement there, because despite the fact that eventually segregation fell, I don't think our adversaries and our opponents gave up very easily. And so now what we're looking at is the same movement toward really the resegregation of public schools, and also the reintroduction of this voucher, primarily by Christian nationalists, folks who are waving the bloodstained banner and using that as a vehicle to say, we're going to take these dollars out of traditional public schools and put them into Christian private schools, many of which are discriminatory based on faith, based on sexual orientation, and also needs and abilities of the student population. So that is the context that we're in here, and the playbook has not changed. The playbook is actually, sadly, just a couple of pages. It ain't that heavy, but it's just the tactics they work time after time. And the reason is because education in and of itself is radicalizing. This is why, I always felt like in the classroom, and I hope any of you all who have spent time in the classroom, you probably feel the sense of energy that comes with it, right? And I always felt like it's all, ministry at the end of the day. The things are very similar. But education comes from the Latin word educare, which literally means to lift up or to pull into. It's the act of moving someone out of the darkness of ignorance and into the light of knowledge. It's a spiritual act.
Preach, brother.
It's a spiritual act because to endow someone with the blessing of knowing something is to liberate them.
Preach.
That's it.
Yeah.
It's to make them, this is why the Greek slave term philosopher Epictetus said, only the educated are free.
Preach. Preach.
And that's a wonderful thing unless you don't want everybody to be free. And that threatens the social order, as I mentioned. And so what's happening is folk who back in the day would have been opposed to everybody being free are at present also opposed to everybody being free. And so I want us to see the through line here. It's not, the playbook is pretty much the same. Maybe added a couple features and bells and whistles, but it's not very complex. And so what's happening now is they're saying that there's an assault on objective truth. Just teach the truth, they say, without acknowledging that the truth, as is recorded specifically historically, is relative to who's telling it.
That's it.
That there are multiple perspectives to the truth. That if we say that Columbus discovered America, that may be true for Europeans, specifically Spanish and Italian conquistadors, yes, but sailors. But if we're talking about Native Americans, is that true to them? And the mere notion of including someone else's perspective is a threat. The accusation of indoctrination is heard, which I think is funny because it is the definition of what is of projection. Indoctrination, the resistance to even teaching or familiarizing the students with concepts. But the actual definition of indoctrination is actually, quote, the process of teaching a person or group to accept a set of beliefs uncritically. Uncritically. In other words, to not indoctrinate would teach them to be critical. But what's actually happening is they're fighting against any critical studies whatsoever. Literally, if they hear the word critical, people's heads explode. And so we have got to begin to call out the contradictions that are really laying there, waiting for us just to lift them up and say, well, hold on, you said you're in favor of critical thinking and, indoctrination is thinking uncritically. So they have to be taught to love America? They have to. They can't form their own conclusions. We can't present all perspectives. And when we raise these questions, often they don't have answers, right? But what I don't see enough of is us applying pressure into spaces where folks are able to get away with these lies, pretty much uncontested.
Right.
And that's what has to change. They don't want young people asking the big questions. They don't want young people asking questions that many of our faith traditions, including ours, have been grappling with since the beginning of time. They don't want people to ask, why are people poor? They don't want young people asking, why is there suffering across the globe? They don't want students to ask, why are some countries more powerful and others aren't? They don't want people to ask, why are people of a darker hue all over the world dealing with subhuman conditions? They don't want to ask, how did our country amass so much wealth and become so powerful? Or why are some people guaranteed rights and others not? They don't want us to ask these questions or to empower young people to interrogate them on their own. And so they level false accusations without resistance, without contestation from us. And that, in this hour, is what has to change. There has to be a counter to the false narratives that are being leveled against people who really just want freedom. So what's the long game? The long game is because of this tremendous fear of the youth being able to access information. And let me tell you something, there's more access to information than there ever was before. And there's some pros and cons to that, right? We sit here with small, powerful computers in our pockets, capable of fact-checking everything I said in real time, as long as you got internet connectivity. It is a drastically different world than it was. Yeah. Even 30 years ago, when I was coming up. And they've lost, in many respects, the ability to manufacture consent or to indoctrinate. So what they've done instead is they started to ban books and create memory laws dictating what you can and cannot teach. And I'm gonna stop here because I'm gonna pause here because much of what I'm talking about, from being transparent, comes from one political party. And I want to be honest in here and say it's not just one political party.
That's right. Preach, brother. Preach.
Because where there has been unification is around the controlling, maybe not of the ideas in K-12, but when you look at the response to campus protests and encampments, you start to notice it even in the higher education realm. Certain people's fascist button starts to get turned on as well. Folks who were open to the idea of dissent are suddenly against it and squashing it, and voting for TikTok bans and all sorts of other nonsense. And so at some point, there's merely a different threshold for the questioning. And so what's the long game is eventually many of these proponents are seeking to create a totally different education system to undo the legacy that was born out of our immediate post-slavery. And if any of you have traveled to developing countries, you notice that the education system there looks drastically different than the one we were blessed with.
Yes, yes.
How so? I'll explain. In many developing nations, you don't have a truly universal public education system. What you often have is one that looks like the pre-Reconstruction years in the United States of America, where the wealthy elites, of course, have access to preparatory schools and are being groomed for aristocracy and leadership, and the rest of the countries are sorted into an assortment of smaller private schools where they vary in quality, and if you don't have the money to pay your school fees, you don't get access to education at all. How many of you have ever been to a country where you've heard young students talk about paying school fees? Latin America, Asia, Africa. That is the type of education system that they are trying to create in the United States of America. One that resembles what we see in the developing world because it reproduces the inequality and creates a virtual caste system that folks will never be able to break themselves out of. And when I say that to folks, they say, that's pretty dark. I told you I'd be honest. That's the privatization movement. That is the long game. Because the one we created here that came out of slavery has actually produced too much economic mobility. Because an education, a public education, in some cases allows you to mobilize yourself from the lowest levels of poverty and be able to change your whole life trajectory. And that's great for you as an individual. But for folks who don't want to pay you a living wage, that's not very exciting to them. For folks who don't want you to live in their neighborhood, that's not very exciting to them. For folks who don't want to have to be dealing with questions of how they've been living their life for generations, and that's not very exciting to them. And so in this moment, we are needed to disrupt this game. Now that we know what's ahead of us, again, the utility of education and history is, now that we know the cycle, how do we get ahead of the curve? We have to return to the prophetic tradition. That's the answer.
Teach us.
The prophetic tradition that has been lost. Many of the leaders who have been silenced or killed, Bishop Romero, Dr. King, my personal favorite. And one of the things he talked about, he didn't have a whole lot of education quotes, but one that I love is when King is decrying spending too much time simply learning about the most rudimentary disciplines. And he talks about rounding out the curriculum with things like the humanities. And from Strength to Love, he writes, the means by which we live have outdistanced the ends for which we live. Our scientific power has outrun our spiritual power. We have guided missiles and misguided men and women. And this is incredibly relevant today because obviously, education is not simply a vehicle of employability where you get the basic skills to join the workforce and contribute to industry. No, that's unfettered capitalism where people are reduced to vessels of labor. This is why we hear the cry that don't talk about that stuff, don't talk about CRT, just talk about STEM. And can we all agree STEM is great? My kids go to a STEM magnet. I just want to be very clear here. Okay? STEM is a great thing. But what King is expressing here is that we don't think more critically about life, to question and ponder our basic assumptions, to challenge conventional wisdom, to be critical and to engage in critique, to evaluate things, and to not simply take them at face value. We'll have a population who does things, and it's not fit to self-govern because they don't have the power to engage in free thought. And that's what's at risk here. It's incredibly disruptive. And so this is why, and as I prepare to close, we have to reject these culture wars and the veneers that are used, the excuses that are used to launder these concepts, to project it, to deflect it, to in some cases outright lie about what's happening in our schools. It's to the point now where folks are criticizing the notion of staying awake, aka being woke. It's become a term that's demonized, a phrase that really comes from black slang that talks about being aware of social injustices. It was a rallying cry. Now it's a euphemism for all the things that folks don't like. Imagine being against things like parity and justice, creating a more just society. Like, what's wrong with folks? So they rather misrepresent the meaning of it. And when you ask these folks what they mean by woke, they can't really tell you. But I again want to draw attention to Dr. King and one of his speeches titled Remaining Awake Through a Great Revolution. In it, he uses the story of Rip Van Winkle, who slept for 20 years. Some of y'all may be familiar with this. It takes place in in colonial America, and Rip Van Winkle goes to sleep. And at the time he goes to sleep, King George III of England is in charge of the American colonies. When he wakes up, George Washington is the president, and Dr. King goes on to say, quote, "This reveals to us that the most striking fact about the story of Rip Van Winkle is not that he slept for 20 years, but that he slept through a revolution. While he was peacefully snoring up on that mountain, a great revolution was taking place in the world. Indeed, a revolution which would at points change the course of history. And Rip Van Winkle knew nothing about it because he was asleep." Who wants us to be asleep? Who wants to keep children so sedated that they cannot recognize injustice when they see it? Who wants to push the perspectives of black and brown communities into the shadows so that they are not included in the historical canon? Who wants to make LGBTQ people invisible and pretend they don't exist and don't deserve basic human rights? Who doesn't want young people questioning the political system to determine whether this is really the best that we can do? Who? And when we think critically about those questions, we arrive at the question of who would be the contemporary critics of Dr. King were he still here, and his legacy. And that's who we find ourselves contesting with. And so, as I prepare to close, there are 4 things we need to focus on in this movement. The movement for educational freedom in this era. The first is we have to, which I hope I'm demonstrating here, we have to be honest. We have to be honest about what's taking place, even if we know it will upset. Inevitably it will. Inevitably the truth is in and of itself disruptive. It's a sword, right? And we need to be able to wield it. In the face of our opposition, in situations when it's inconvenient, we need to be honest. Second is we need to be vigilant. Because as I mentioned before, this is not a plan that grew out of the ground. This didn't just emerge a couple of years ago. This is a strategy that has been enacted and reified over and over again over the past 100 plus years. And so, we need to strap in and put our seatbelts on. If it's going to be a bumpy road, we need to be vigilant, we need to be persistent, and we need to be resilient in this fight, because it's likely not going to, victory won't be won overnight. We're going to have to come back again and again and again to re-win our rights.
Preach, brother.
Be courageous. Why is this important? Because I think that our enemies are counting on us being scared.
Yeah. Ah,
Oh, Lord.
yes, Lord.
They're counting on us being scared. And listen, at times we are scared. Right? But we also know we've not been given the spirit of fear, but of power, love, and soundness of mind. Okay? So where love is, fear cannot coexist with it. And so we need to be able to say the truth, even when our voice is trembling, even when we are scared. Doesn't mean that we just, we ain't scared of nothing. That's not true. Folks like to play, like our generation say, you're scared to go to church. Even in church, you're scared folk, and folks outside the church. It's okay to be scared, but we need to take heart in those moments. Right? Even when danger is staring us right in the face, even when we're literally in the lion's den. And lastly, we need to be ready. Be ready for whatever comes. Prepare ourselves. Get organized as you all are doing right now, so that when the opportunity to take action presents itself, we are in position and we are prepared. We ought not be surprised. We ought to be doing the most that we can to assemble ourselves and to be in position so that we can start to enact change and to preserve the right for freedom. The rights that once were fought and won over 150 years ago, that will have to be won generation after generation. I want to thank you all for your attendance, for having me, and encourage you all to be honest, be vigilant, be courageous, and be ready. Thank you so much for your time.